are you clapping? Ethan, again. Hey, John, how are you? Gee whiz.
Well, good evening.
I was wondering why they were clapping.
Yeah,
I haven't done anything.
we haven't said a word yet. We'll see if they change their mind by the time we're all done here. I'm David Sanger from the New York Times, and more importantly, a graduate of the college here. And I'm delighted to be here tonight with General Michael Flynn, who graduated from the University of Rhode Island in 1981 and was in the 82nd Airborne Division, which means that if he doesn't like the questions, he'll just pull the parachute and make his way out. General Flynn has been in the military side of intelligence for many years, and our full biography of him is in your flyer here today. But what we thought we would try to do today is talk a little bit about the Defense Intelligence Agency, not an intelligence agency that you often hear as much about as, say, the CIA or the NSA in recent days, but one of the nation's largest and most important of the intel agencies. Then we're going to talk a bit about some big global changes, some global hotspots, and some big issues like cyber that have been coming along. And then after that, we're going to turn to all of you and get your questions as well. So General Flynn, thank you very much for coming to Harvard and coming here today. There are 16 different intelligence agencies in the US government, which is astounding when you think about it. Tell us how the Defense Intelligence Agency is different from the others and how its mission is particularly different.
So first, let me just say thanks for inviting me and to be here tonight. It's a great opportunity for me to share some ideas and share some huge issues that our country's involved in with in terms of national security. The Defense Intelligence Agency, there's 16 agencies or 16 organizations in the intelligence community. There are what we call the Big Five, and the Big Five are the Defense Intelligence Agency, Central Intelligence Agency, National Geospatial Agency, the National Reconnaissance Office, and National Security Agency. So those are the sort of make up the broader components of the intelligence community. DIA is the only agency with defense in its name. So we are responsible for defense intelligence for everybody from the President of the United States on down to all of what we call our combatant commanders and our war fighters, to our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines that are out there sort of on the nation's edge. Just to give you a scale of what DIA is about 17,000 people. We're in 141 countries around the world. We have people that speak over 60 different languages. We have, we cover that range of languages from our agency. We are primarily, though, a defense all-source intelligence agency. So we don't do signals intelligence. That's the National Security Agency. We don't do imagery intelligence or geospatial intelligence. That's the National Geospatial Agency. We do all source. So we take open source and we take all the other ints, if you will, all the other intelligence systems and sources that we have, and we bring it all together. So when somebody wants to know what are the intentions or the capabilities of a particular threat or challenge or some entity that we may face out there in the future, we're the ones that have to answer that question. I mentioned to David that we also provide for the nation. We are the top secret communications provider for not only the Defense Department but for the nation writ large.
I was White House correspondent for 6 years, and wherever the president goes, there's a DIA contingent that goes with him for the White House Communications Agency. Yeah. Is that right?
I mean, that's right, and we service about 230,000 customers around the world with basically top secret communications, and that's actually one of the most secure, protected systems that we have in the world, and definitely in our system. So that's kind of give you a broad scope of DIA, you know, who we are, the size, what we do, but really defense, and we provide all source intelligence assessments for, like I said, from the president on down to our warfighters out there on the battlefield.
So we'll get to specific hotspots in a moment, but you spent a lot of time thinking, I just know from our own conversations, about the big global changes that change the world that you are trying to assess. Energy, water scarcity, food issues, food scarcity, urbanization, the movement. I think you said earlier today that, 400 million people will be moving into cities in China just in the next...
Within the next 10 to 15 years.
10 to 15 years, that's more
just in China alone.
Just in China alone, it's more than the entire population of the United States,
That's right.
moving from country to urban areas. And then, of course, the huge increase in information technologies, which we'll get into a bit. Why are these issues that DIA has to spend their time on?
Well, I would just tell you that when we look at where we are today and the scale and the scope of some of the security challenges that we face around the world, we also, you know, that's sort of the here and now. We also have to be thinking about the future, your future, particularly for a lot of these young faces that I see out here. You know, and I'll just give you a little bit of background. You know, in 1950, post World War II, so 1950, there was a global census taken. At that time, the number count for people on the planet was about 2.3 billion. Fast forward to 2010, just a couple of years ago, they did another global census, and that time it was about 6.8 billion. So prior to 1950, you know, from the time there was a human being walking on the planet up until 1950, a couple of billion people. In 60 years, the size of the population of the planet tripled. By 2050, it's expected to multiply by 5. So we're looking at somewhere close to about 10 billion people on the planet by the middle of this century. And all of that move, it looks at as we assess this, the security environment, all of that move is going to go to the urban centers. You know, and so urbanization is clearly on the rise. As David just mentioned, 400 million Chinese within the next 10 to 15 years are expected to move into cities just in China alone. So when you begin to think about the scale of the numbers of people and then where those people are actually growing. So it's not in what I would call the Western world. You know, the Western world, which would be the United States, West Europe, maybe parts of East Europe, the population rates are about anywhere from about 0.5 to about 2 children per family. In other parts of the sort of the undeveloped or less than developed world, it ranges from about 6 to 10. So we're looking at places on the planet where there are going to be large numbers of people in locations where there are not the strength of institutions that we take for granted in this country, like rule of law, you know, healthcare institutions, you know, certainly legal institutions, and you know, medical and those kinds of things, education, things like that. So we are going to face a challenge with access to, and not only security, but also when we start talking about access to food, access to water, access to energy resources. You know, we take it for granted that this mic's working and these lights come on. You know, you go and you run the water in the morning to brush your teeth. Many places on the planet that doesn't happen. And in many places on the planet, there are places where there is no electricity, but there's lots of people, millions in many cases. So these are security challenges that have changed quite a bit. The other component of that is the information age. So, you know, most of you, as I look around this room, are on Facebook. Well, Facebook actually popped up in roughly February of 2005. You know, today, you know, it's whatever, the third largest planet or third largest country in the world, right? We have billions of people, about 3 billion.
General Flynn not only popped up, but it was actually invented right across the street.
That's right. So I you know, the information age or the the advent of the information age, 50% of the population on the planet is supposed to be connected by the internet by 2017 alone. Again, in this country, we take it for granted. On the continent of Africa, there are about 47% of the global cell phone market is on the continent of Africa. So many of you don't understand when I say we moved from two-pair copper wire in this country to 3G and 4G. The people in Africa moved right into 4G communications capability. So all they know is what they have. And with that comes a big challenge, because when we start to think about social media and Twitter and how movements are shaped, and for those of you that have paid attention or will pay attention to what is going on in the sort of the Arab Spring, so to speak, a lot of that has been shaped because they've had access to information. And one of the things that we are going to have to do from a security standpoint, we're going to have to figure out how do we put sort of microphones over those societies to try to figure out what is going on, what are the underlying problems that they face. Those become huge security issues that we're going to be dealing with, that you're going to be dealing with as I look around this room at some of the young folks.
Well, General Flynn, we'll get to the microphones over those societies in just a bit, because that's obviously been one of the bigger issues facing the intel world lately. I wanted to just turn you, just before we get to some specific issues. I think when you and I first met, it was around the time that you had written this fascinating report called Fixing Intel, a blueprint for making intelligence relevant in Afghanistan. And this was at the moment that you were beginning to take analysts who normally sat at their desks in Washington and began to push them out in the field the way covert operatives have been out in the field for many years. But the idea was to actually begin to get them collecting much more at a ground level and tighten up that loop so they weren't sitting to wait for information. In fact, at one point in this report, and this was the nicest thing I've ever seen the intel world say about my profession, that one of the things you were doing was select teams of analysts who will be empowered to move between field elements much like journalists, to visit collectors of information at the grassroots level, carry that information back with them to the regional command level. And then you went on with a number of other ideas about how you would basically shorten up those loops. So 4 years later, how well have you done on your Fixing Intel blueprint?
So the idea is to get what I describe as a fingertip feel for the operational environment, regardless of the operational environment that you're in. That, in this case, in Afghanistan, it was a battlefield. So what I felt we lacked was a real strong fingertip feel for what was going on at the local level. And I felt like we had a great handle on the sort of the enemy that we were facing, but I didn't think that we had a grip on what was going on, because this is a really local issue. This is a tribal local issue. So we needed to do that. So, we tend to think of Washington, D.C. or the headquarters as the center and not the edge. And what I really wanted to try to do was to get our analysts to feel part of that edge and to get them out. So we created one of the solutions that we developed was what we call these stability ops intel centers, and from there analysts would go out with operational forces and help in the effort to gather information. In fact, we call them in there information gatherers, to be able to gain that fingertip feel, to have a better sense of what was going on.
And you also you've had for some time, but I think you've accelerated some, the Defense Clandestine Service, which is basically parallel with what the CIA has as the National Clandestine Service. Tell us what they would do, how it would differ from, say, what a CIA officer would do.
Yeah. So it's not necessarily parallel. What it is, it complements human intelligence requirements that we have for national security needs. The Defense Clandestine Service is, as it says, it's defense, and it supports defense needs when required, though, because we are also part of the national intelligence effort. When required, they can also be tasked or required to go after national needs as well. If there's anything that we learned in the last decade of operating in these different environments, particularly as I just described, sort of the human environment that we're facing out there, is the need for more human intelligence. And from our perspective, ours being the Department of Defense and defense needs, we need to know, again, intentions, capabilities of some of the threats and adversaries that we face, and we need to have people that are schooled, so to speak, trained, who are military professionals and understand what the kinds of things are that we're going after to be able to address some of those needs. And that's really where the Defense Clandestine Service, its real niche is in that realm. And we work very, very closely in a very tightly integrated way with our partners at the national level.
So let's turn to a very specific problem that you've had and began to get really as soon as you left Afghanistan, and that's Syria. So at the opening of the Arab Spring, if I remember this right, all the intel agencies were providing assessments to the president and talking about them publicly, that they thought that Bashar Assad, the president of Syria, would probably be gone by the summer of 2011. You'll remember that the actual first protests began 3 years ago this week in the Damascus markets. So here we are 3 years out. We have a civil war whose scope is beyond anything I think any of us had imagined at that time. You have an area between Iraq and Syria that many are concerned is becoming a new training ground for al-Qaeda affiliates. Give us a sense first of just what the scope of what you're facing there is today.
Yeah, so and this is something that I think for all of us, this audience that's here in this room, and frankly for anybody else that listens to this, we're going to be dealing with for quite a while. And let me just talk. I'll stay inside of Syria for a bit, but I think that there's regional and international implications for whatever the outcome is. On the opposition side, because that's probably one of the most complex things that we're dealing with. Never mind on the Syrian and Bashar al-Assad side. And I'll talk to some things that we've already sort of stated in public. The number of groups that we believe that make up this opposition, it ranges around 1,500 different groups just inside of Syria alone. 1,500
groups comprising how many people?
Yeah, so that number roughly, approximately is about 100,000 people in the opposition of, that make up these 1,500 groups.
So some of these groups are 10 people.
Some of these groups could be, they're small numbers. They could be, some are larger, and there are clearly some that are dangerous. Inside of that opposition are what we now define as extremist elements, and that number roughly is at about 25, maybe up to 30,000. So you can begin to see, again, and everything's clear in hindsight, but you begin to see the scale of the opposition. And then the real challenge these days that is of concern to the international community is the foreign element inside of this the extremist group inside of Syria. That foreign element, equates out to about 7,000 foreigners from around, quite a few countries around the world. Some from Europe, some from the United States, some from Asia, some from Africa. So that foreign element, as you've written about and as you've seen, and I think hopefully is being discussed here, what is it that happens to them once they decide that that they've done enough inside of Syria, and they decide to what we are beginning to see as an outflow coming out of Syria and then returning back to their countries of origin. So that's a real concern, because even those they may be small in number coming back, they're very dangerous because they've gained experience, they've gained some training, because we do know that there are camps inside of certainly inside of Syria where there's some training going on, and
they're beginning to flow back out.
Yeah, like just that side alone is very, very complex, and so from an intelligence perspective, assessing the who's who in the camp there, and trying to precisely, advise our leadership on who to deal with and how to deal with them is a monumental problem.
We reported in this morning's paper an example of what kind of decisions a president's having to make about who to deal with that's drawing on your intel. The example we gave was that for several years now, President Obama has been very reluctant to give advanced weapons, including man-pads, for example, these portable anti-aircraft weapons, to the rebel groups, because as we learned in Afghanistan, once you hand it off, you have no idea who's ultimately going to get it. And obviously there's a lot of civilian airliners flying in this region. You don't want those weapons turned against U.S. forces and all that. And yet you've got this incredible humanitarian problem now where you're seeing barrel bombs being dropped on Syrian civilians from helicopters. And the civilians are saying we have no way to combat these helicopters without anti-aircraft. So tell us, using that as sort of an example, or maybe you've got a better example, what is the president, what are the commanders in the region looking for from you to help make the judgment about whether or not to more heavily arm the rebels? Are they looking to understand who the rebels are? Are they looking to understand how the weapons would be used? What are they asking you for?
Yeah, so for the students primarily, sort of a 30 seconds on what intel does and what policy decides. So what David's asking me is how do we assess the situation and the framework of what we're facing, because some of the actions that come out of that assessment are then policy decisions by the president in this case to decide on how to respond,
who he's going to give weapons to, who he's
provide.
not.
So we're being asked today, as I just highlighted the opposition, we're also being asked for the region's assessment. What do we assess the region sees and feels? Iran, Lebanon, Saudis, Egyptians, Israelis, Jordanians, all these different countries, Iraq, that make up the sort of the trans-region area. We're being asked to what is our assessment of how those countries perceive what's going on, and what are they doing on any given day, and how might they respond to something. We're also being asked to assess the internals of what is happening in Syria, and if this scenario or if that scenario, given what you're asking, what might be the outcome? What might be the likelihood of something additional occurring? And I will tell you again, for the president today to have to make the decisions that are being contemplated, it's a very, very difficult place. And the best that we can do, and the best that we should do, is make sure that we give as complete an assessment of every single scenario, option, angle that we can possibly contemplate for the potential outcomes of what might happen.
But that could be a short term, and as I said, we didn't get right as a country how long Assad would be around, or how long Kim Jong-un would, how well he would do in North Korea. But then you're also asked to do a much longer term assessment. So, for example, if this goes on for 2 or 3 more years, would the map of Syria necessarily look the way the map of Syria looks like today?
Yeah, I think that, and this is really one of the $64,000 questions. What is the outcome of this thing? What is the likelihood? So you have to look at a whole range of scenarios that are likely to occur, because again, this is something that mainstream America probably doesn't really care about. But if you're in the national security arena of the United States, you've got to care about it. So you've got to consider history, you've got to consider the current situation, and you have to consider, as you're saying, how much longer does this go and what happens? So a scenario, a definite possibility or a possible scenario is the potential for a fragmenting of the region into, the borders were put in the beginning of the last century, and so we have to be thinking about what might the region look like if this thing continues on and goes in a direction that nobody really wants it to do.
And this is one of the reasons it's so hard for President Obama, I assume, that you had a fragmented, extremist Sunni state within what is now Syria, then he's dealing with a problem that could be as hard as having Assad in place.
Yeah, and do they become nations, nation states who will contribute, or do they just become, a piece of the landscape and very, almost conflict zones?
I'm sure we'll come back to Syria some in the Q&A, but let me move on to Edward Snowden, an issue that we've all been discussing a lot about. He worked as a contractor for the NSA, not the DIA. I'm sure there's not a morning you don't get up and say, that's actually an improvement, right? That's good news. Yeah. But you recently completed a report about what kind of damage he did, and my memory of your testimony in Congress recently during the threat assessment testimony was that roughly 2/3 of the material that he had taken or that he had access to, you said you had assumed he had taken it, but that he had access to, you believe was more of a military nature than about, say, domestic surveillance, whatever the NSA was doing to collect the metadata from the phone calls that everybody in this room makes and others. What does that tell you?
Yeah. So first, I just, to talk a little bit about the National Security Agency, because I've worked with them. The men and women in the National Security Agency are extraordinary Americans who come to work, and they're just like you. I mean, they're a bunch of young people who are incredibly dedicated to this country, and they are doing what they're asked to do, and they do it in an extraordinary way. And I personally know that they have saved lives on the battlefield and in many other places around the world, even for our partner nations that we work with. So the scale of this problem that Edward Snowden has caused, we describe it, we define it as causing grave damage to the United States. It's not grave damage to NSA. Obviously, it's had an enormous impact on the workforce at NSA. It's not grave damage to the Department of Defense. It's had an enormous impact on the Department of Defense. It is grave damage to the United States of America. And, considering, and again, sort of hindsight, all the ways that he could have, done what he has sort of stated what he wanted to do, there's a lot of other ways to do that. And the scale of the problem, I think it kind of got lost in the metadata and very technical things that were going on at NSA, and were they listening to conversations at home, when actually it really, when we start to look at it, as we have examined this thing fairly thoroughly now, we're still in the process of examining the impact. A lot of what he touched that we assume he took have nothing to do with NSA, have nothing to do with the NSA sort of quote unquote collection or listening programs that they have, which are all legal, by the way, and constantly briefed to Congress. Most of it was, majority of it was defense related. So if he was only going after NSA to go after NSA, he touched a whole bunch of other information.
Well, tell us why you think he touched that. I mean, I reported a few weeks ago that he had actually managed to put a web crawler inside the NSA's computer systems. And for those of you who aren't computer science majors here, a web crawler basically goes around and indexes and copies everything in its wake, so that he could go off and be at work and do his job, and at the end of the day, there would be the data that came down. Do you think he got all this military information because the crawler was just sucking up everything that was in its path, or do you think that he was looking for military information?
Big answer is I don't know. What I would tell you is that the more we look at it, the more we begin we have to make some assumptions about the kinds of information that we know that he ended up touching. And so...
you keep saying touching. Touching doesn't mean he took it.
Touching doesn't mean he took it, but we have to assume that if he touched it, and in the ways that we are, examining sort of the forensics of the kinds of ways that he did what he did, my judgment is that he probably took it. And but at the end of the day, we still don't know because of the way it was done.
And do you believe that he was acting on his own, or do you believe that he was acting on behalf of a foreign power?
Yeah, we have no evidence that he was acting on behalf of a foreign power. Clearly, because of where he's at today, and knowing what I know about, the Russian system, that there's no doubt that they will, work him as we would work somebody to try to gain, access to what he actually knows and what he did. So we should not be naive to not think that they're not, that they're going to do that.
In general, a lot of spy scandals have diplomatic impact. This one, it strikes me, may have a bigger economic impact. Think about the things that we've heard in recent days. Angela Merkel, who herself was surprised to discover that her phone calls were being monitored, has declared just in recent days that Germany should go out and create its own protected internet system with its own encryption. The Brazilians have said something similar. Microsoft, meanwhile, at the other end, has said they need to develop encryption systems that the NSA couldn't get inside because they're afraid that all the publicity from all of this will make their foreign buyers think that if you buy a Microsoft product, you're basically going to put data into it that will end up on your desk and your colleagues' desks in a few days or a few weeks. So is one of the results of this whole set of events that we are going to now see the balkanization of the internet, the great unifying force that we've seen in the world in the past 2 decades?
Yeah, I'll tell you, it's an interesting, the whole issue of transparency and secrecy, and the game of intelligence, the really serious game of intelligence that's going on around the world and has been. The advent that you see and you read about intelligence far more than you ever did, than I ever did in college, and certainly even in the first decade or two of being in the service. I think for everyone has to look at this case, and there's not only a first order effect, the effect of what we are already seeing being disclosed in the media. There's a second order effect, there's a third order effect, there's a fourth order, a fifth order. There are going to be effects that are going to be military effects, that are going to be economic impacts, that are going to be diplomatic and political impacts for potentially many years to come. We have already seen in the media reporting that you've seen since disclosures started to come out, impacts. And so, we have to judge what those impacts are. From my standpoint, right now, what we're trying to judge is the impacts to our defense capabilities. And those are, others are looking at the impacts to the sort of the diplomatic, the foreign policy areas.
But I was asking you something different, which is, if the world actually ends up dividing up the internet, and individual countries say, I realize we were all linked together in one happy family, but we now don't trust the NSA just as we don't trust Chinese intelligence, and we don't trust Russian intelligence, and we don't trust criminal groups that are going after data and target. Could you face a world in a few years in which the internet has actually been cut up into pieces and you have to go out and examine data in individual subsegments of it?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. You know, I don't think that's going to happen because I think that just the explosion of technology, the advancements in technology, the things that I'm seeing for in the world of sort of the bigger world of telecommunications, I think that that's unlikely. Now, I think that there will be, I believe that, and as we're seeing in some cases, there will be, you know, dialogues inside of countries, between countries, you know, international forums that are going to explore, are these all possibilities? And should we move in this direction? But I just think that the global economy and the global information era that we are in, and that's exponentially growing, I think that's unlikely.
A related question to that, and then we're going to go out to all of this. The other big threat you're facing these days are cyber threats. The United States government is spending billions of dollars on cyber defense, which it talks about a lot. Spending billions of dollars on cyber offense, which it talks about very rarely. You've had a recent cyber experience just in the past few months with an Iranian attack that made its way into an unclassified part of the Navy's and Marine Corps' intranet. Tell us a little bit about that, and then what you're seeing in the way of cyber attacks from other countries as well.
Mm-hmm.
But start with the Iran one.
Yeah. Well, I won't get into the specifics of it because it's, you know, it's one of these things that we constantly review in our own networks. But, you know, we all have to know, and our defense systems, our networks, our defense networks are constantly being probed, being attacked, being, you know, exploited, if you will. And, you know, in some of these cases, what we have to determine is the attribution of who's doing it, who's actually behind it. Because the thing you have to remember is that behind every one of these attacks, when somebody says a cyber attack, there's a human being sitting at the computer terminal, and there's probably another human being that is sort of commanding and controlling or organizing, you know, these kinds of efforts. So it's not just machine to machine. This is about human beings and understanding intentions and capabilities. The longer somebody is in your network, obviously the more you have to understand how long they've been in there, what they have left behind, and what kinds of things might they have exploited.
And what they have left behind may be a sentinel,
well,
an
that's
implant
right. It could be
to be able to attack the
that's
system
right.
later.
It could be some type of capability that is new, that they're trying out. I mean, there's a lot of different aspects to cyber, to the world of cyber, as our adversaries are exploiting our networks. And I will tell you, from the defense side, I'm confident in how we account for and protect our defense networks. Not perfect, but pretty good. Where I'm more concerned about is our other than defense critical infrastructure within our country that constantly
power
plants, banking, financial institutions, transportation systems, healthcare systems, the gamut. And that's an area where there are a lot of weaknesses, and I know that we have, you know, not just state, but we have non-state entities, actors that are out there working that system.
And at the same time, as I said, the United States is also developing offensive weapons. It does not run largely out of DIA, but it does raise the question, does it make it harder for you to defend systems when the world knows that the U.S. is using this as another weapon? I mean, every time there's been a new technology and a new weapon that's come along, whether it was nuclear or other kind, the United States has been in the lead in developing these weapons as well. So does it legitimize the use of cyber weapons that the U.S. is also on the offense while on the defense?
Yeah, I think that, you know, whether or not something is a weapon system or not that becomes actually kind of when we start to talk about, the legality of war and things like that. And I will give you this answer, and I think what we have to resolve to is that cyber is a capability that allows for, and again, sort of from a defense standpoint, from a national security and defense standpoint, it allows for offensive operations, it allows for defensive operations, it allows for exploitation. So it has an impact, and it will have an impact. The other aspect of sort of warfare is what we call rules of engagement. So we have pretty strict rules of engagement. We follow international law, and we are accountable for what we do. Some of the states that we face, and definitely the non-state actors that we face, do not necessarily follow that or adhere to that, to any sort of strict rule of engagement. And that's one of the, if there's a outcome to everything that we're talking about, there has to be an international conversation about how to operate in this domain or in this space that exists internationally, because it exists, it's all around us, and it's clearly having an impact. And we can't just keep going back and forth in this sort of very tactical way, and then something suddenly happens and it causes us to do something physical.
Well, that's a great spot to turn it over to all of you. So there are some microphones that are set up. There are 2 here, and then I think there are 2 up on the in the rafter areas. The 3 rules out here, we just ask that you identify yourself, ask 1 brief question per person with no speeches, and actually end your question with a question mark, which sometimes is harder than it seems. We'll start right here with you.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Max. I'm a member of the forum and a freshman at the college. One of the things you commented is that the NSA programs that the 2 of you were discussing are both legal and reported to Congress. But a DC district judge, federal judge, just ruled that it's probably unconstitutional. And one thing that's been in the media and given a lot of material to comedians recently is that James Clapper, the DNI, said last year to Congress that there was absolutely no intel program recording millions of people's phone conversations. So my question is, on what legal and other bases do you think that those programs are in fact both legal and constitutional and were indeed reported to Congress?
Now, you're a smart kid. I can't address the legal issues, and I'm not in a position to address the legality, other than to say that what I am aware of and how the National Security Agency follows what it's been directed to follow is above board and completely in compliance with sort of the rules that they have been given. As far as a judgment, I'll let that sort of play out. I would say though that we and as I look at you, as a young man, it is about the discussion that we have to have for the direction that we want between, in security, civil liberties, the freedoms that we cherish. As we go into the future, and as you're sitting up on a stage like this, in 30, 40 years, the kinds of challenges and the kinds of things that we are going to face over that period of time, to me, are mind-boggling. What I have seen in 33 years of being in the military are extraordinary. I can't imagine the next 30 years and what the challenges are that we're going to face. I would tell you, though, that this issue of transparency, security, again, the freedoms, the civil liberties, we still have to be accountable. And I would tell you that Flynn's opinion, the National Security Agency is very accountable. They're accountable to the right people, and they do what they're asked to do. It is going to be as I said earlier, the second, third, fourth order effects of what has happened is going to cause us to maybe limit ourselves. We may self-limit because, you know, of the challenges that we face certainly on the legal side, and that concerns me. That you know, we have to be we have to follow the rule of law, but we also have to protect this country. And so, you know, how we adjust and adapt to whatever rules are you know, brought down from on high. I hope I hope those kinds of decisions are made by people who consider sort of the long haul of what we're going to face as a country.
General, if I could just drill down your answer there for one more moment. You said we may self-limit, which we may well do from this open debate that you've just identified. Had it not been for Snowden, whose techniques I know you've got a lot of problems with and who you said did a lot of damage, would we be having this open debate? And is it a good thing that we are debating this in public? Because I'm not sure the president would have given the speech he gave last month, weighing the privacy issues versus the security issues, had Snowden not forced that to happen.
Yeah, I mean, that's clearly an effect of what has occurred. You know,
a good effect or a bad effect?
Well, I think it's an impact. I mean, it clearly caused an international debate. You know, good or bad. You know, others can judge that. I think from my perspective, you know, as I look at it, you know, was there another way to approach what he wanted, what he says he wanted to do? You know, and if he says that he's won, which he's sort of claimed he's done, then if there's any other information out there, you know, give it back if you've already sort of done what you wanted to do. And that's what I would tell him.
Of course, this digital information, if there could be copies, I'm not sure he could give it all back if he wanted to. The Russians and the Chinese have it now, as you suggested. Not likely to be handed back, right?
Yeah, well, I would just say that, you know, if he feels like he's accomplished what he wanted to accomplish, and he does have other information, then and he believes in the United States of America, then give it back.
Sir.
General Bob Goldstein from Senior Executive Fellows Program. I'd like to get to the subtitle of your lecture. It's the Way Ahead for Defense Intelligence. And with 16 formal agencies or organizations handling intelligence, Defense Department taking heavy hits for, in these days of sequestration, budget cuts. What you've mentioned so far are burgeoning industries for intelligence, cyber, human. Where do you see the intelligence community going so that efforts are consolidated and it becomes more efficient?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And we are, you know, the financial constraints that we face now, and as we project out, certainly over the next 5 years or so, we're taking a very hard look at, you know, where we grew quite a bit. For example, counterterrorism. You know, so there was a huge sort of industry, if you will, to use your word, that you know, grew post 9/11, and so we're sort of reshaping that to make sure that we have that about right to address the problems that we face. So there's some you know, to use a bad word in government, efficiencies that are occurring. I would tell you for the IC, the intelligence community, one of the areas that we're really taking a real hard look at is information technology. Information technology, as I mentioned, you know, our customer base is about 230,000. We spend a lot of money on IT across the intelligence community, and so we are looking at a range of you know, sort of collapsing some of our systems, you know, and really moving into, you know, the sort of the cloud environment and leveraging technology in the communications world, because IT costs the IC a lot of money. And that's where we think we can find a lot of savings. And in fact, one of the big initiatives right now that Director Clapper has ongoing is the Information Technology Initiative within the USIC. It's probably the single biggest initiative in the U.S. Intel community ever.
Does moving into the cloud make you more vulnerable or less vulnerable?
Much less.
And
Much
can you tell
less.
us why?
It's a much more secure environment. You can observe it easier. You can, you can see what's going on.
So if there was a Snowden operating in the cloud, you'd be able to tag the individual
Yeah.
and the data
Yeah,
together?
and in fact, that's exactly how we are, that's what we're moving towards. Tag the data and tag the individual. So we know exactly what an individual is doing, because if you're working in government, that's just the way it is. What an individual is doing and when they're doing it, and does somebody come in and start to really, disrupt the system somehow. So it's a much more secure environment. The other area I think that is we're taking a hard look at is open source. Open source provides much more of the information environment today. So how do we adjust our analytic, the all-source analytic footprint to leverage the open source community? And we know that there's some savings in there. So, I mean, from our perspective, from DIA's perspective, we've already taken some big steps in the last year that have avoided millions of dollars of cost, and also reduced our reliance on contractors, because we grew quite a few contractors over the last decade, and we just don't have that luxury because we don't have the money to do it anymore, and so our reliance on contractors has to go down quite a bit. That they came at a cost, and those kinds of capabilities we are moving away from. And so that means we have to do smart things like invest in to continue to invest in the people that we have, so our own sort of professional workforce, and education, training, professional development is an area where we're actually putting a lot of money behind to make sure that we take this, what I would kind of call a period of acceptable risk over these next probably 5, maybe 10 years or so, about as far out as we can see, and ensure and assure that we are training, educating, and developing the workforce that we do have. Because for us, we've had about 6,000 of our civilian employees have deployed to Iraq or Afghanistan over the last decade. So we've got to, and most of them are in their 20s and 30s. So we've got to take them and prepare them for the next future. And that's a big aspect of where we're investing, and that comes at the cost of some of the money that we've put into contracting over the years.
Question right here.
Hello, I'm Jacob. I'm a freshman at the college. Some journalists have argued that the amount of information that a lot of these intelligence agencies collect is just so large it's hard to effectively manage. How have you dealt with that at the DIA, and do you think it's a serious problem that you're currently dealing with?
Yeah, it's a huge problem. And I'm glad to see that we have at least one Patriots fan in here. Right? It's a huge problem, and that's the argument. It's kind of like, people describe it as you got a stack of, a haystack of needles, and you're trying to find a needle, So, there are tools that we do have, but you also need to ruthlessly prioritize what it is that you're trying to find. And I used this analogy before. It's kind of like if you've ever been to a beach and you see the guy down there with the device, and he's sifting sand at the beach, and he's trying to find, somebody's wedding band or something, or he's trying to find a golden nugget. Well, he's got an entire beach to collect on. Maybe the beach is a mile long, a couple miles long. When you talk to some of these people, and I have actually over time in my younger days, you find out, well, how successful are you? And the guy says, I'm very successful. Why? Because I've watched and I've observed where people are at and where things happen, and so that's where I go and gather. That's where I go and sift at the beach. So it's kind of like that. I mean, we have to prioritize where we want to sift the sand so we can find that sort of golden nugget of information that allows our decision makers to make better decisions. You can't just say, well, start on that end and go to this end. You'll never get there. You have to have a very prioritized system. And I will tell you, for the intelligence community, the president actually starts that. He's the one that directs what our national intelligence priorities will be. And from that, that sort of spreads out down among the various intelligence systems that we have to go and answer those questions.
do those priorities get out of date fast enough? I mean, one of the arguments we heard when people asked, why were we listening in to or monitoring Angela Merkel's cell phone? The answer was somebody started that program in 2002 or 2003, and no one ever reviewed it later. So do we have a problem here that contributes to what our questioner has asked, which is it's very easy to start up new things. It's very hard to kill them off.
Yeah, and I think that there's a lot of, I think that the issue is about what legacy aspects of what we are doing out there continue, and so for all of us, and it's like coming out of Iraq or in Afghanistan, we're going to have things that we turned on that we're going to have to adjust from. And so I think the same thing,
Got to learn to live without it.
You do, and you just have to say that this is no longer important, and what's the direction that we want to go.
Got a question right up here.
I'm Avica. I'm a freshman at the college, and I have a question on behalf of one of our Twitter followers. It's, how do you ensure voices from outside the Department of Defense and Intelligence committees are being heard inside the agency generally and in analysis?
Yeah, great question, and that's partly why I'm here. And our outreach to academia, so the schools that we deal with, DIA, we deal with about 78 universities and colleges around the country. We recruit from them, by the way, from this school as well. www.dia.mil. So we also reach out to think tanks. So we have a great relationship and interaction with a lot of people who are thinking about these similar issues, and have access actually to other parts of other aspects of the international system than we may have as being in the intelligence community. So we do that's a big part. For me personally, I spend a lot of time on outreach and making sure that we're working with others than those just in the intel community, because otherwise we would just, we'd be, basically doing intel for intel's sake, and that's never a good thing. What we have to do is do intelligence work for a much broader community, and these days that broader community also includes our international partners. And so I would tell you that even our outreach to our international partners, both intelligence and other aspects, their academic institutions, their think tanks, also play into the assessments that we make. That's a great question. Thanks for asking it.
You know, we've had 3 questions from freshmen so far.
I know.
I can tell you, when I was a freshman, I don't think I had the confidence to go do this. Sir.
Good evening, sir. My name is Frank Brumell. I'm a first-year Master's in Public Policy candidate here at the Kennedy School. My question has to do with, after 9/11, one of the main complaints was that intelligence agencies weren't sharing information enough. And so there was kind of an explosion in just the amount of information that almost anyone could grab on, whether it was the SIPRNet or JWICS. After the Bradley Manning releases, that was kind of curtailed a bit and brought back. I left active duty right as the Snowden leaks occurred, so I don't know what's happened since then. But do we run the risk of going too far backwards as a result of these releases and the leaks in order to protect the information and end up hampering ourselves in trying to maintain that interagency communication that was so important in the wake of 9/11?
Great question. Are we re-stovepiping?
Yeah. So, one, thanks for your service, and I congratulate you on taking the step that you've taken to be where you're at. Our watchword in the United States intelligence community is integration. Okay, so the vision is that we will be a nation made more secure by becoming fully integrated. And so it's kind of like, real estate, location, location, location. In the intelligence business, it's integration, integration, integration. You cannot live in your own world, licking your own ice cream. You have to integrate. If there was one thing that we learned on the battlefield, was fusion of operations and intelligence, was bringing capabilities and people and talent together physically. And so what we have to do is constantly, keep our workforces from the leadership level on down on this idea of being an integrated community. My deputy, as an example, is an officer from the CIA. So when you begin to look at, like, even our structure, we have people from NGA, NSA, FBI, CIA, NRO inside of leadership positions in our organization. So it's not just sitting down together and sharing information. It's also about everywhere we are to be integrated. Joint duty, as an example. Joint duty in the United States intelligence community now is a must, especially for our civilians, if you want to be promoted to a senior executive service, to like a flag level rank in the civilian side. So integration is across the board, and it's definitely in the idea of sharing of information. And, you know, I mean, one of the things I was responsible for in one assignment was basically running the monthly information sharing council for the IC, where everybody's around the table, all the agencies are represented, and if there was an issue, it would come to our level, and at the DNI level, national intelligence level, and we would adjudicate it, and we would make a decision about it, and if there was an issue, we would resolve it right then and there. So there's actually not only, you know, a good idea, which is integration, but there's a great process that we have. So if somebody is out there and says, well, they're not sharing, we actually do have a very disciplined mechanism in place to make it happen. And I'll tell you, for our military forces, it's a constant battle because they are out there in the battlefield or out there in areas of responsibility like Africa or Southeast Asia, and they need to share more and more with our partners out there, our foreign partners. And so we do that pretty well because integration clearly is with ourselves, but it's also, we have to, and we're looking at a lot of different ways to integrate with foreign partners, to allow them to use our intelligence to do to take care of their own national security issues. Because our intelligence system is actually, I call it one of our national strategic advantages. When it's precisely focused, it really is probably one of the best capabilities that we have for our national security.
But I think his point is that the sharing does make you more vulnerable when you have an insider threat like Snowden. I mean, think about what Snowden downloaded. Huge number of files from GCHQ, the British equivalent of the NSA. Australian files, files from other countries that all share our intel. And just as Bradley Manning, who was sitting out in, I guess, Iraq at the time, found State Department cables, and of course, he was not a diplomat. So I guess the question is, how do you do that balance? I mean, there are a lot of people in the intel community who are saying right now, we have taken this too far.
Yeah. You know, every situation has to be judged for what the issue is that you're sharing information about. But, you know, what you just described about Snowden kind of answers part of my question about how far outside of just NSA he went, you know, because he's already disclosed some of these other areas. But I would tell you that for us,
the answer is well out of NSA.
Well outside.
Yeah.
I mean, for us, I think that it's out there, the challenge of should I share, but, you know, we can't sit and wring our hands about the possibility for another individual who's, you know, sort of in your ranks. You know, we don't, I mean, if we did, then we would just shut the entire system down. So it's a big issue, but integration is the way that we are going to move forward, and that means working together as a community, you know, on behalf of the nation's security.
Sir.
Not a perfect system.
Gentleman up there has been waiting.
Thank you. My name is Gregory. I'm a sophomore at the college. You've spoken about, I guess, information sharing and efficiency, and now I'd like to ask you a question about the delineation of responsibility. Given the recent rise of the Defense Clandestine Service and the, I guess, consternation about who gets to control the CIA's Predators and other drone technologies, where do you think the line between the Department of Defense and other members of the intelligence community should be, and why?
I guess on those issues, on those couple of things that you mentioned?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, yes, and also just like how you
He
kind of
mentioned
approach
two,
the issue.
drones
drones
and
and
the
human.
defense.
Yeah.
Clint, Clint, that's fine.
I think that we have to, I mean, if you don't hear about it here, it's, everything that we have to give to, frankly, the president or, our combatant commanders, our senior military leaders, are options and tools. And so, without kind of going through the litany of, whether or not we need those couple of capabilities, we need as many options and as many tools as we can possibly afford, and then they need to be, they need to be accountable, and they need to be managed and led properly for what they provide to our, any decision maker. So I think that whether it's human, whether it's the world of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, which is, what you're talking about with the specific capability on like a drones, for example, whether it's, other types of weapon systems that we think we are going to need, or whether it's how we might leverage intelligence sharing with a foreign partner to gain an advantage. How we do that. Those are tools and those are options that as many as we can provide, many as we can afford, we should have them.
The President gave a speech last year in which he said that the drone program would move as quickly as it could out of the covert world, many of the drone attacks run by the CIA now and so forth, and back into your building, into defense. How's that going?
Yeah, no, so those are policy issues that are being discussed.
Well, he said he made a decision. I mean, he's trying to move it. My question is, how is it operationally? Do you see that that's happening at this point?
Well, I would just say that it's still under debate. Mm-hmm. It's still being judged, and and you're going to have, of course, multiple sides on the issue as to which direction it should go, whether it should be where it's at. But I would just tell you that in the world of how we do business and in the Department of Defense, those are capabilities that we do have, we do use, and we use very effectively.
Right here.
Sir, Scott Manor, I'm one of the
Hey, Scotty, how you
executive
doing?
fellowship. Sir, I was
One of
curious.
the best analysts in the world right here. One of the best intelligence analysts in the world. I'm serious. This guy has, yeah.
Thanks. Sir.
Yeah.
So the question I have is kind of a big ballpark question for you, which is after 13 years of war, with the withdrawal from Iraq and reduced footprint in Afghanistan, we're looking at prisoner releases in Afghanistan. We've seen massive jailbreaks in Iraq, civil war in Syria, destabilization along North Africa. Looking at that in your career, what kind of a report card would you give the United States government in the war on terrorism as you look at where we stand now versus where we were on 9/11?
Yeah. And I just say to you, Scott, just unbelievable. I mean, if you just had a glimpse of what Scott has served in and for, you'd be blown away by what he's done. So I think that it's a really difficult question and an issue, because the only way to get terrorists off of a battlefield is to capture them, turn them, meaning make them, turn from whatever their ideology is, or to kill them. There's only three ways to get them off the battlefield. So if you capture them, and to kind of go back to the tragedy of Abu Ghraib, which we experienced, and then to try to change the system, which we did, to be able to make it much more accountable, much more to standard, and much more effective. And now, you bring these people to justice through their own country's systems to the degree that you can. Some, that are brought back to this country, that are indicted, etc. In some cases, you've seen that recently. I do think that we have a national debate and I know what's going on because we were asked about it during the testimony to the Senate Armed Services Committee the other day. What do we do with them? That is clearly a policy issue, and whether a Gitmo closes down and something else, you have something else somewhere else, whatever those decisions are, I will tell you from an intelligence perspective, and you know this, that we gain an enormous amount out of those individuals who we are able to capture. And I think that, I'll sort of leave it at that because we actually are able to understand a heck of a lot more when we do that. And so I'm really, by what I've seen in terms of prison breaks that have occurred, through the sort of the trans region, and others who have been let out, I think they're all very dangerous. They don't typically change in some of these prison systems that they do have, not in all cases. And so that's a dangerous thing because when they go back out on the global battlefield, they are likely, to a certain percentage, go right back to what they were doing. And in many cases, they're much more connected. They're much more networked. They've probably done and they've learned a lot more in the systems that they're in, the prison systems that they're in. So, because we've seen all these things. So, this is an issue that, is it existential to our country? Is it going to cause our country to collapse? Or is it something that we should be concerned about because we don't want to have, a mall attack like we saw in Nairobi or a Mumbai-style attack like we saw in India? We just don't want to have those kinds of things, and frankly, I'm surprised we haven't.
Scott raised Afghanistan, and it raised an interesting question. We've read about two options for the end of the year. The President has said by end of 2014, the United States will be out of Afghanistan. He's raised the possibility, if they can reach an agreement that President Karzai is willing to implement, that we would leave a small resident force, maybe up to 10,000, in country. The other option, called the zero option, would be everybody out, we close down the bases we have in Afghanistan. Tell us how that would affect if the U.S. had to go to the zero option. What impact would it have on your intel on Afghanistan and on Pakistan?
So anybody that studies, and hopefully in some of the stuff that I've looked at coming up here and talking today, the study of warfare is really interesting because there's a lot of aspects of everything that we do. And there's something called an economy of force principle. Principle of economy of force means when you go to apply that principle, you have to increase your intelligence capabilities. You have to increase your intelligence collection because when you go to economy of force, that means you have less forces to do things with, whatever it is, whether it's 0 or 10,000 or whatever the number is. And so therefore you need a lot more intelligence capabilities to be able to figure out what's going on and what's happening. So from our perspective, we are, given whatever the options are, whatever the final decision is by the President, we are working with ISAF, we're working with Central Command, the International Security Assistance Forces, we're working with our international partners, principally out of NATO, on what is the scoping of the intelligence requirements for all of these options. And there are a range of them. And my belief is that you're going to need, we have quite a bit out there now, but you're going to need to scope it correctly in order to continue to assess what the issues are going on out in that theater, because we still know that there are elements of Al-Qaeda that remain out there. We still, call sort of the Afghan, Pakistan, Fatah area sort of AQ Central or AQ Core. So we know that there are still militants and other militias out there, other insurgent organizations. So the Haqqani network is still out there. So, you have organizations that are still going to be dangerous, whatever the options are.
Well, thank you, General Flynn. You have given us a great tour of the horizon, both countries and hotspots, but also big global transitions. I thank you for coming up, for taking questions. I thank all of you for what were terrific questions along the way, and I hope you come back.
Great,
so
thanks
much.
a lot, David. Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks. That was good.